All right. Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Matt Zakreski. And if you are watching this recording, you are here to learn about asynchronous development. I am a clinical psychologist from New Jersey, and I love working with the gifted population and neurodiverse kids. And in order to do that, we really need to understand asynchrony. So that's what we're here to do. So asynchronous development, how to keep it together when things aren't together. So I'm going to start by telling you a story. So one of the kids I work with, and I've changed some details here, but the core parts are certainly the same. Jake is a 7-year-old boy. He has an IQ of 162, and he's a second grader at a school for gifted students. And Jake is extremely advanced in math, right? So Jake takes graduate level courses in calculus at the local university. He is brilliant. He understands math like some people understand how to breathe. And it's awesome to talk to him about it. It's awesome to see his brain work on it. It's really cool. Jake also was sent to me, not because he has a 160 IQ, but because he has pretty much constant meltdowns, and they were happening every morning. And it's because Jake really struggles to tie his shoes. Now, you might think to yourself, what's the big deal? But if you are an asynchronous person and your brain is so advanced that it can do graduate level calculus at 7 years old, but you can't tie your shoes, you can imagine how painful that might be. And while certainly we could teach Jake how to tie his shoes, that was not the whole story. And we're here to talk about the rest of that story today. So as we grow up, as we evolve as people, there are several areas of development that we do. We develop as social creatures. We go from being very independent and alone to making friends, to making good friends, to making best friends, to making groups of friends, to starting to have romantic and sexual relationships, to having committed relationships, to maybe getting married. And so those social skills and social developments evolve as we go. Our emotional skills evolve along with us. Intellectual, we get smarter, we get more able to work through systems, we know more, we're able to tap into more areas of knowledge. Our psychomotor skills develop. If you've ever watched a 2-year-old try to walk, you know that there's a big difference between a 2-year-old walking and a 5-year-old walking, just like there's a difference between a 5-year-old and a 10-year-old and a 15-year-old. This is an area for which that Jake had problems. There's fine motor skills. And then, of course, we have a chronological age and things that are baked into our societies, what we expect an 8-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 20-year-old, a 30-year-old to be able to do or not do. And sometimes those things are, I expect a 30-year-old to have a job, right? Perhaps their own apartment. I don't expect them to pick their nose, right? That's something we would expect maybe a 7 or an 8-year-old to do. And a big part of this is working with asynchrony is understanding the role that our own expectations, spoken and unspoken, play in how we work with kids who are asynchronous. So asynchronous development refers to the mismatch between cognitive, physical, and emotional development that is often seen in gifted and neurodiverse children. So here's a nice sort of screen grab that gives us an idea of what this might look like. Each one of these boxes represents sort of a range of functioning, right? And you see your average learners, neurotypicals, right? Things basically hold together, right? And above average learners, people in that sort of 115 to 125-ish range of IQ, they have that, they're some higher levels, some higher ceilings, but, once again, they more or less hold together. When you get into gifted learners, you see the significant asynchrony, higher highs, and then also lower lows. And if you note these two columns here on the end, social and emotional, this is where asynchrony tends to get us. Social and emotional development. And there's some brain science behind this that we're going to get to in a moment. But this is why you tend to see gifted kids who have different ways of interacting with others, tend to have more meltdowns, tend to get more upset. So this is sort of, thinking about asynchrony as bands of functioning with high highs and low lows is a good reframe. So the definition of asynchronous development is when the social, emotional, and physical and creative aspects of a person develop at a trajectory that's outside of norms. And that trajectory is uneven. That is asynchronous development. And that asynchrony implies a greater complexity, both internally in the person's mind, but also in how they present externally. These qualitatively different experiences, they occur in all cultures, ethnic groups, and segments of society. And that's really important, right? This is not just how kids fit in school. It's about how they present in the world. And every person has strengths and weaknesses. Every person has bands with which, right? If we go back, each one of these little boxes represents a band of functioning, right? Some stuff is typical, right? If you have a 1-year-old baby that hasn't quite taken their first step yet, there's nothing wrong with that. The band of functioning there is about 15, 16, 17 months. We want that baby to take its first step. So, but the contrasts here are much more noticeable in the gifted child. So the Columbus group, when they sat down to try and sort of really like wrap this this idea together, they said that giftedness is inherently asynchronous, and it has advanced cognitive abilities and heightened intensity, which if you work with this population, I think you know about the heightened intensity, and they combine to create inner experiences and awareness that are qualitatively different than the norm, right? So once again, we have this idea that there's a richness, there's an intensity, and there's a significant difference than neurotypicals. The higher the intellectual capacity, the more asynchrony we experience. And the uniqueness of being gifted renders these people particularly vulnerable to maladaptive behaviors, to not fitting in with the systems that exist. So we have to require modifications in parenting, teaching, and counseling to help them develop optimally, right? The system is built for neurotypicals. 68% of them are between the, one standard deviation down, one standard deviation up. And that's great. We had to build the systems to teach the most people the most stuff. But when you are 2 standard deviations away from the norm, or in the case of Jake, grade 4, then, that inherently requires modifications. Right? We need to understand that our kids are at different places and then build our systems differently to accommodate that. So these are activities that you can do at home. So obviously 2 volunteers isn't necessary. This is what we do if we're doing it live, but grab a piece of paper and something to draw with. And if you can find someone to do it with you, even better. I'm going to give you 30 seconds to draw something. So you can pause the video right now and get your stuff. I'm going to keep talking. You have 30 seconds to draw that. Go. All right. And time. Okay. So take a look at your tree. How do you feel about it? It probably does not look as good as this tree that I have here on my screen. And of course it doesn't, because this is a photo of a tree and you didn't know what was coming. And there's no way you could draw that in 30 seconds, even if you were the caliber of artist that could do that. And obviously those caliber of artists exist. I happen to be married to one. So the reason I do this exercise is that if you think about your art in terms of good or bad, you're always going to find something wrong with it. If you think about your art in terms of a developmental trajectory, like, is this something you spend a lot of time on? How developed are your fine motor skills? How developed are your visual processing skills? To do something like this, to take an image you see and transfer it to a piece of paper, isn't, cognitively speaking, it's an incredibly difficult task. So the fact you're able to do it at all is really rather remarkable. So we say this as just a way to reflect on the fact that drawing a tree is not as simple as drawing a tree. It has to be seen through the lens, the spectrum of who you are as a person and what your developmental pathways are. So when we think about development, these circles, this sort of pie chart way is a good way to think about it. And I often use this exercise to help conceptualize what asynchrony looks like for families, right? So we have our ring of chronological age, we have academics, fine or gross motor, verbal academics, social skills, special skills, and emotional development, right? So this is a neurotypical person, right? Things are basically the same for chronological age. And an asynchronous, a neurodivergent person, you can see that special talent has gone past chronological age, as math and verbal. Social is basically where we'd expect it to be. Motor is slightly delayed, and emotional development is significantly delayed. Now, if we think about like, is giftedness truly a gift, right? Which is, I think a thing we've all struggled with at some point or another. This is the toughest part about giftedness. This is the part that I think a lot of people don't tell you, is that the amount of energy that it takes to bring that gifted brain online means that that energy is taken from somewhere, right? And oftentimes it shows up in this lagging social and emotional development. Now, there are things we can do about that, and there are ways we can fix that. So don't worry, stay to the end of the talk. I promise you we'll get to what to do. But this is the reality of having that gifted brain. And not everybody shows up to this level of asynchrony, but it is a easy explanation for things that for your kid that don't necessarily make sense. And this, if you've ever been to a talk on giftedness, I'm sure you've seen this particular chart. This sort of spread of skills. Once again, the emotional piece is way down here. Intellectual skills are way over here. And, this is the sort of thing like researching Greek mythology on their own and creating high-level papers, but also fighting with their siblings about who gets to sit in the front seat, right? And it can be frustrating and draining. And I always think about when you think about spread, right? In developmental spread, like we see in the lower chart here, I think about tension. And as a psychologist, when people are under tension or under stress, they tend to act out. They tend to have behaviors that are ways to manage that stress. This person is under a lot more stress than this person. And as this handy diamond thing over here says, if you have a kid who's twice exceptional or thrice exceptional, you're feeling that asynchrony to a much higher level. So ultimately, what does all this mean, right? That's what we're here to talk about. The more gifted the child, the more synchronous they are. There's this common experience in the field that every gifted kid is 5 kids, right? And this is, to use Scott Barry Kaufman's idea that each gifted kid contains multitudes or as many kids at once. Each kid is their chronological age, and they may or may not look that age, right? The physical development might be different. Emotional age. A lot of gifted kids get referred to me before we even know they're gifted kids because their parents or teachers describe them as an old soul. That's a well-worn chestnut in this particular field, right? And it tends to come with a lot of meltdowns, right? A lot of pressure, a lot of emotionality. Social age. Gifted kids often prefer older people because there's a intellectual synchronicity there, right? The intellectual level of a 6-year-old whose brain is like a 15-year-old is going to want to talk to older kids because they can hang, right? They can talk about older kid things. And the struggle is, can they connect with their same age peers, right? Especially if those same age peers are neurotypical. I've seen play groups for gifted kids, and there's a lot of parallel play, right? There's a lot of like sort of I'm doing my thing and I'm doing my thing and I'm doing my thing. But when they do come together, it's a high level conversation around things, even if they don't all understand the same thing, right? A gifted person understands a gifted person, even if my gifts are in writing and drawing and yours are in computer coding, because I don't speak computer coding at all. The question is, can you connect with someone who doesn't operate on that wavelength to you? And that's why finding your tribe is so important in this field. Intellectual age, psychoeducational testing is going to give you really good levels for that. And then motor skills. Gifted students often lag behind in fine motor skills. And obviously we talked about the shoe tying example, but this is where we get into like what I like to call the reverse school effect, right? You talk to a neurotypical kid. What do you like most about school? I like recess. I like gym. I like art. I like music. Great. Those are really cool things. You talk to a gifted kid. I like math and science, computer coding and English, right? And they don't like those things because they're more unstructured, but gym, art, and music in particular require a high level of motor skill. Painting, drawing, playing the recorder. And if your body is lagging in those particular skills, which is normative for the brain you have, but nobody else is experiencing that, and it can feel very isolating, very stigmatizing. You look at any recess field across the country, most of the kids are playing some sort of game, some sort of ball game. And if your skills lag in that area, it's something that you feel immediately that you don't fit in. And that's tough. Like we said, the more asynchrony, the more stress a kid is under, we get into expectation effects, right? We need to set expectations for our kids. These are the things that come really easy to you. These are the things you're great at. These are the things that you need help with. Those things aren't bad. Everybody needs help with some things. And I know that they may not be the things that your peers need help with, but what you are, we're accepting you for who you are and what you are, and most importantly, where you are right now. Around 7 or 8, which is where a lot of this stuff will flare up, kids are developing their sense of self. And that's going to come through increased independence. But gifted kids are developing their sense of self by wondering, what are my peers doing? Why am I thinking about that? And that's psychosocially a more advanced concept. So there's once again, there's a friction, there's an asynchrony, because their neurotypical peers are going to be a little bit more independent, and the gifted neurodiverse kids are going to be more social. Once again, there's another tension in that system. And when we think about, neurodiversity and asynchrony, we say that sort of can compound or totally exponentially enhance the feelings of asynchrony. This chart right here is a really good idea of sort of laying it all out there, right? How we respond to sensory stimuli, concentration and distractibility, word finding, speech problems, goal-directed behavior. All of these things intersect. The more neurodiverse your brain is, the more asynchronous your brain is, those differences, it's going to manifest as oftentimes as stress, which then we're going to see as the adults who care about kids as behavior, right? Meltdowns, fighting, screaming, crying, all that stuff. It's because the internal system is under so much stress. So why does this happen? We are learning a lot about the brain. We're learning a lot about how it comes online, how it develops. And some of this is bleeding edge science. We know that gifted children have unusually fast brain development in the cerebral cortex, but 6-month, 12-month, and 2-year checkup marks. And that brain volume increases more in the second year of life than a neurotypical person. We see this more in the hippocampus, which is areas of memory, and amygdala, which is fight or flight and emotional systems. So these brain volumes manifest in more connections, more neural connections, and that rate stays high, unlike the autistic brain, which that level tends to fall off over time. So the energy to create all those connections and take your cerebral cortex, the part of your brain that makes you, right? And make that so high powered, so online, that takes a lot of energy developmentally and physically. And that means there's less energy for other development. So you often see a resultant lag in your psychomotor cortex, and these, we're talking about high levels of neural activity that we are seeing, really sort of play out in real time. It's fascinating to watch these studies, but what it means, in the way of like my child on the playground in school right now, is that their brain has these differences, right? The natural differences in the gifted brain, many of them come from the prefrontal cortex, which is about right here. And that's, the part of your brain that is executive functioning, right? So that's personality stuff. It's also the ability to regulate behavior, regulate emotions, monitor other people. And if that part of the brain comes online later, it's more likely to make mistakes. It's more likely to struggle with organization and self-monitoring and impulse control. And we think about our kids and how they show up, yelling out in class, impulsively doing something, abandoning a project to start a new project. And I can see all of you nodding out there in the universe right now. And that's because that brain is coming online later. Now, in neurotypical kids, the prefrontal cortex doesn't really fully mature until their 20s, which explains a lot of college behavior. In neurodivergent kids, that development might not finish until late 20s, early 30s. So we're going to need to have our kids have more scaffolding, more structural support to help them get to that level. And, as we reflect on this, and I hope that you're watching this and you're thinking about your kids, but also thinking about yourself, if giftedness is a family affair for you, did this happen to you? Did this happen to your partner? Are these things that you dealt with in your life? What things worked for you? What things didn't? It's amazing to me how often when I talk to families in my role as a child psychologist, I'll talk to a family and they'll say something like, oh yeah, this was totally me as a kid. And I wish someone had understood me. I wish someone had supported me. But anyway, I wish my kid could get it together. It's like, you just said that was you 30 years ago, and you didn't get what you needed. This is an opportunity to make that right. So some more brain stuff here, synaptic development. So, this idea, right, is the more dense our synaptic connections are, the more information can travel, the more information can intersect and abstract and turn into ideas and creativity. For many people, the idea of their brains developing feels like this sort of like strange concept, like it's the sort of ghost in the machine. But we can look in microscopes and we can see on fMRIs like this is how the brain works, right? And when we're young, our brain overproduces neurons. They make too many, and over time they get pruned, right? And the neuronal connections that remain are well developed and strong and muscular, right? And it's sort of a survival of the fittest sort of thing, use it or lose it. And in the gifted brain, this process is enhanced, and you're getting the connections that remain are stronger and more powerful. So, we know the gifted brain has more connections and thus is more efficient. And we also know that energy that it took to get that there had to be pulled from somewhere. So we think about what is underdeveloped and what therefore is asynchronous. And it's important to remember that the brain is plastic. The brain can adapt and change based on personal experience, developmental norms, epigenetics, trauma, right? But it means that where your kid is right now means that that's where they are right now. That's not good or bad. It's just the reality. It's where we're starting. But the brain can adapt and change and learn new skills. We just need to be willing and invested to teach it. So the gifted brain has, as Edna Moll always helps me with my acronym here, has difference in morphology, size, shape, and quantity of brain structures, operations, the brain operates differently, location, how and why the brain is used. And this gets deep into sort of the neuro-individuality stuff. And because we are short on time, we will pause that for right now. And I promise that if you ever come to one of my other talks, we'll go deep into it. And electro-neurochemical functions, right? We know that gifted brains have more connections and more, they fire at a greater rate. They also have different levels of neurotransmitters, including serotonin. So thus, all this means is that giftedness is a distinct neurological profile. Gifted brains are different brains. So now that we've explained sort of what this looks like, where this comes from the brain, now we get to talk about sort of what we do with that, right? So here's some parenting strategies. First and foremost, we start with our kids' strengths. Whatever changes we want to make are going to come from a place of strength. So we help our kids and we help the adults in their lives understand the meaning of being gifted, the strengths and weaknesses that come with that, and what asynchrony is. When you know all of that, we can set realistic expectations. If we go back to Jake, I explained to him that his brain works differently, and the same developmental pathway that sent him to graduate school at 7 is also hurting him from tying his shoes. But once we put that in context, it still was hard, but it made sense. The big thing for our kids is when they're struggling and they don't know why. So giving them why, giving them context is very helpful. We explore strategies that help us understand and navigate being out of sync. Mindfulness is a really good one, how to self-advocate, how to explain your situation to others, and using mind-body tools. Anything that gets your brain and body flowing is something that's going to help ground our kids and help our kids feel more stable and secure. Things like yoga, doing martial arts, rock climbing, American Ninja Warrior. These are all things that help our kids get grounded in their own bodies and thus more in control over them. You want to do multiple peer groups. This isn't just I hang out with the kids in my class. One group might have a chronological fit. One might have a mental age match. One might have a deep level in interest, right? I work with an 11-year-old who's really into astrophysics, and his best friend is a 45-year-old professor who lives in his neighborhood. And they hang out 2 or 3 times a week, and they go on walks and they talk about celestial bodies, and it's adorable. And that's, most 11-year-olds don't have friends who are 45, but this is a cognitive and interest match. Bibliotherapy, reading books, watching TV, movies, Netflix, YouTube, with main characters who also have unique abilities and uneven development. Certainly Sheldon Cooper would be an example of this from Big Bang Theory, but the show Atypical, Rosie Revere Engineer, Ada Twist Scientist, there's lots of stuff where you're going to see examples of this it play out, and have your kids engage with that material and say, what is that like for you? Does that fit your experience? Once again, it's about putting things in context and making us feel less alone. When connected with other parents, I know that Maryland Gifted has an incredible support system of parents and professionals and teachers. There's certainly the supporting emotional needs for the gifted as a parent group. There's a lot of stuff out there. You want to be able to share these experiences with other parents who get it, and then help educators understand what your kids need. Education is about knowledge, and knowledge is power, right? So if you are having trouble explaining to teachers and administrators why your kid is the way they are, contact somebody like me, contact somebody from the Support Professionals Network through Maryland Gifted, because we can help put that information into context and explain it. Because otherwise the school is going to say things like, it's strange that Sally, who is writing, the great American novel at the age of 11, also is sobbing, crying because she got picked last in dodgeball. And I think that's weird. And to a certain extent, it is weird, but we don't want their confusion over that to turn into negative feedback, and that becomes a negative feedback loop for kids. We want to put it in context. This is an area that we're developing. That's all. And when your kid has an emotional outburst, and they will happen, they're going to happen. You might have one as soon as you're done listening to this. Before you respond to an emotional outburst and therefore conclude that your child is socially or emotionally immature, stop and remind yourself of your kid's chronological age, because that behavior might be totally in line with what's expected. And it's so hard because our kids are so articulate and so charismatic and passionate, and they create and complete so much stuff. And it's easy to forget that it's still a 9-year-old, and this is something 9-year-olds do. And that's not easy, it's not fun, but it is understandable. And context in this is everything. So one way to think about this is riding bikes. So if you were helping your kid learn how to ride a bike, you could stand at the end of the street with your arms crossed and say, okay, ride your bike to me. And your kid would probably sooner or later learn how to do it, but there'd be a lot of scraped knees and banged heads and sobbing, crying, and maybe a trip to the emergency room. Or you can stand right behind your kid and guide them along until they're ready to go on their own. Now that's harder, right? It's a lot more energy for you, but I would argue you're going to spend the time either way, right? So if your kid needs that extra hand on the bike, if the kid needs training wheels right now, that's just where they are. That's not good or bad. The more we engage in a way that's moving forward, right? We don't want to hold them still, but we want to move them forward in a supportive way. As long as we're moving towards developing skills and independence, it's okay to be right there with them and help them learn how to ride that bike. So now we talk about school. We have atypical kids. They're going to need atypical strategies. I say that to every school I work with. Probably they're sick of hearing it. I'm going to keep saying it. We got to think outside the box, meet the kids where they are based on their current levels of development, allow your kid to soar where they're doing great, the highest level of challenge and enrichment, and provide support for any area of weakness. This is not good. This is not bad. It's just reality, right? If you think about the basketball player, Shaquille O'Neal, right? This is a bit of a dated reference. Dominant basketball player, right? I mean, anything within 10 feet of the hoop, he was either swatting away or dunking. But Shaquille O'Neal couldn't shoot free throws, which is one of the easiest things to do in basketball. And so they ran an offense that was like, okay, get the ball to Shaquille O'Neal and he's just going to dunk it because he's really, really, really good at that. But nobody was ever able to unlock the thing for him, like how to shoot free throws effectively. And it became this really stigmatized, painful thing for him and his whole team. Now, he still had an incredible career. He won multiple championships, won an MVP trophy, in the Hall of Fame, right? So, but you could also argue that he left a lot of success on the table by never addressing this asynchronous part of his development. And it's something for us to think about. It can be difficult to find reading material for kids that works both at a content level and a challenge level, because the more challenging books tend to have more mature and challenging themes. This is where we talk to librarians, we talk to other gifted parents, what's working for your kids. Your kid might benefit from an alternative educational placement, acceleration, online learning, homeschooling, unschooling, lots of options out there. And I would never pull a kid out of public school willy-nilly, but we need to consider outside the box solutions for our outside the box kids. If this Jake, Jake has a family who is willing to drive him to a college to do graduate level math, right? Not every family has the time or money or energy to do that. So we need to think about the things that actually work and are possible and practical for your family. Asynchrony awfully shows up in lagging executive functioning skills, particularly attention, organization. So your kid may need additional support and skills training. This is where I think the idea of the absent-minded professor shows up, right? A lot of smart people don't do so good with remembering things or organizing things. Every time I work with a gifted kid, I'm always like, all right, what did they leave in my office this time? Shoes, hats, coats. I could clothe an army with the stuff that's been left in my office over the years. Include one time a walking boot. I don't know when the kid actually took it off, but the walking boot was left in my office. Your kid's gonna need additional support and skills training there. That's just a reality. We advocate, and we remember that intelligence and knowledge, right? Our kids can know things and learn things and figure things out. And that doesn't mean they're emotionally mature, and it doesn't mean that they're necessarily empathetic or necessarily wise. They may be, but let's not equate the two. So imagine then you're a 6-year-old, you have an IQ of 144, and you have the verbal capacity of 11-year-old. Now you've got to do some writing. Now, most kids, right, are like, I saw a TV show. And maybe you're talking about, you have this idea in your head about a bear who has a magic cape that allows them to fly. And you're getting ready to get that idea down on paper, but you don't have the fine motor skills to write that fast. And you don't necessarily have the time or the amount of paper to get those ideas out. And maybe you don't know every word you need to know. So what we have is another way in which asynchrony flares is that when there's a disconnect between ideas and skill set. So I have these beautiful, incredible ideas up here, but I don't necessarily have the words or the fine motor skills to get them out. And that's why it becomes so important for a lot of gifted kids to let them tell stories, right? Let them have a scribe, someone to write it down, or let them use voice to text or even type it out. You're going to find that they get more words out and feel better about what they're producing because they may not have the fine motor skills to do it in the time allotted. So this is a, sort of an example of something you might see in, in a typical 6-year-old classroom. And you can imagine if you have the verbal capacity of 11-year-old, that's not what you want to write. I know spring is here when, most kids are saying when baseball starts, right? Your kid is going to say is when the sun has moved into a celestial position. And we're starting to talk about astrophysics, right? So we need to have prompts and flexibility within the classroom that's going to appeal to the different ages. So this is another version of telling stories, right? The kind of stories that our kids tell are, it's a skill to tell a story to an audience. So giving kids feedback of what kinds of stories we tell to different kinds of people in different kinds of settings it's not only a social skill, but it's also an intellectual skill. And you and I might have a very different conversation at a bar having a beer after a conference than we would right now if you asked me a question, right? And and those are the sort of things we need to think about. That's a social skill. But our kids who have all this knowledge and this passion to share it may not understand the difference. So we need to help them do that. So then we get into social development. Gross has suggested that we have play partners, people to chat with, help and encouragement, people who someone can offer support and encouragement. We get into intimate and empathetic relationships and how giving is receiving support is helpful, and then having those best friends with respect, support, and trust. Now, neurotypical people are going to move slowly through this process. Oftentimes, gifted kids want to move right to stage 4 or 5. I cannot tell you how many times when I worked at a school for gifted kids that this person is my best friend. Well, you've known them for about 3 hours. Yes, they're my best friend, right? Because there's that desperation, but also this like, I finally found someone who's on my wavelength, right? That's everything I've ever wanted. So we take that information, we put social strategies into place. We don't want to hide talents for the sake of building friendships. They also don't need to hide their weaknesses or gaps, right? We present ourselves as we are. We maybe put ourselves in situations to succeed, but we don't have to hide. We can have different kinds of friendships with different kinds of people. 11-year-olds can hang out with 45-year-olds to talk about astrophysics. And then their birthday party is really mostly other 11-year-olds because that's appropriate. You may play chess with grown-ups, and you may do art class with kids younger than you because maybe you have lower fine motor skills right now. That's okay. We work on perspective taking activities. We develop empathy. We always think about how are my actions being seen by others and what does that mean? Follow your interests and passions. You find your people, and whether it's archery or fencing or croquet or coding, there are groups out there that do it, many of which are other gifted or neurodiverse people who are seeking their own communities. We set expectations both internally and externally. Lots of gifted kids think that others are like them, right? They'll think like me, they'll act like me, they'll speak like me. And when they realize that's not the case, oftentimes kids will shut down, they'll withdraw. And we need to sort of, once again, put that in context, right? It's not that you're not normal, because you aren't normal. It's that your brain is different, and your brain is going to do better with people who have brains like you. We focus on quality of friends over quantity of friends. And parents, this is mostly for you. Online friends can be and are real friends, right? That might be weird for us on our generation, but they really can be. So when we talk about games, we talk about oftentimes gifted kids will try to change the rules. They'll make up their own rules. They'll make the game more challenging. And when we think about how that makes sense up here, are our kids communicating that in a way that other people can understand it? And if so, does that even make sense, right? Can you stay with what everybody else is doing? And this is that intersection of the intellectual asynchrony. Oh, I can do all these wrinkles to the game that makes it more interesting. But the social emotional piece of like, can I communicate that to my peers? What happens if they say no? What happens if they don't understand it? Am I going to melt down? So you need to think about how these different kind of games play. I can't tell you how many times I've had a gifted kid play soccer and realize, boy, it sure would be faster if I just picked up the ball, because it's more efficient, Dr. Matt. Yes, but that's rugby. That's not soccer, right? So Rules that are explicit and implicit need to be communicated to our kids. Otherwise, they're going to struggle. So Dr. Linda Silverman, said that our kids feel out of sync, and these differences make our kids feel vulnerable. And I think reminding ourselves of that is a very important step. So as our kids get older, they have more responsibilities. More responsibilities lead to more stress. Stress brains work less well. So once again, we need to have a better communication about internal and external expectations. The nice thing is that as our kids' brains mature, they get more efficient. So they can develop skills and coping strategies. So they're going to have experiences to pull back on. So, and the self and the system get more educated. It's like, okay, I know this is the thing that happens to me. I will communicate this to the people involved in my life. So we have to adapt that we're getting better, but the challenges are getting stronger at the same time. So we need to be able to balance those things. So, when you think about social asynchrony in real life, right? An 8-year-old boy who has the intellectual level of a 13-year-old, the physical size of an 11-year-old, and the social emotional skills of a 6-year-old gets invited to a party. What party are they going to do best at? A 5-year-old, a 10-year-old, or a 15-year-old's? And you think about what those different kinds of parties look like. Who's invited? What are they doing? You're probably not playing 7 Minutes in Heaven at a 5-year-old's birthday party. There's a decent chance it's going to show up at a 15-year-old's. Are our kids ready to handle that? But on the flip side, what does it look like if you look like an 11-year-old and you're at a 5-year-old's birthday party? We have to think about how these things work. And for a lot of parents, I think they end up deciding that birthday parties are very tricky and maybe smaller groups is a better thing. But I don't have a great answer for you here. I just want you to think about this. So if you remember the circles from before, right? We have areas for social development, emotional development, intellectual, physical motor, special interest, and academic. So either download this talk or pause this right now and draw your own circle and say, where am I on these, right? If the circle is your age normative development, where's my kid? Where are my students, right? It's a nice visual representation of sort of how people are and how they fit together. And anytime you see an area that has a lot of white to it, that's an area where they're going to need a little extra help and a lot of extra care. So lots of great resources on this, certainly more than we could talk about in a 45-minute talk, but I want you to do some extra reading. So here we go here. And if you have any questions, please feel free to connect with me on social media, on Facebook or LinkedIn, and email me at drmattzakreski@gmail.com. You guys were wonderful. I hope this was helpful. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Otherwise, I will hopefully see you soon. Take care, be well, stay safe.